Questions first. Raise your hand if you're feeling pretty healthy. Yeah? Awesome. Most of you. Cool.
How many of you have ever dealt with some kind of illness?
Apparently, we all know from experience that our health is not a static condition, and our bodies, they're not stagnant sites.
So if we can begin to think of health in this way as something that's constantly changing, constantly in flux, then providing healthcare must mean helping people cope with the changes that are taking place in their bodies. So why is it that we're seeing all these statistics that not only say that that's not happening, but that exactly the opposite of that is happening, that somehow healthcare is making people feel worse? For example, that 20 to 30% of patients in US hospitals receive circumstantially adverse care, or that the third leading cause of death in the United States is iatrogenic illness, which is preventable harm caused by medical treatment or examination. That's a lot of people that are seeking out the chance to feel better and actually being made to feel worse. So is it that biomedicine is really failing us, or is it that we're not seeing the body realistically, or is it some combination?
Even in something like alternative medicine, which is seen as a creative way of healing the body, we still think that for X problem, there's Y solution. And we know that this just doesn't make sense. For example, holistic healthcare provides us with the opportunity to learn about the tools to understand our own constantly changing body. But for some reason, we're still dissatisfied when we come to something like yoga or acupuncture and are presented with a multifaceted response that seems to handle peripheral issues, what seem like supposedly negligible factors of a change in our health.
So often we're not getting what we want, and we're also not getting what we need. And this all happens often despite how many tools we have at our disposal, from holistic methods to biomedicine. So what is it that we're missing?
Natalie and I propose that the answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing. No thing. Emptiness. The principle of emptiness is called sunyata in Sanskrit and was written a lot about by the philosopher Nagarjuna. He was in the 2nd century, and he wasn't the first person to have this idea, but he was the first one to write it down, and he wrote a lot about it. And it's the idea that all things lack an unchanging essence. So what does that mean, that everything has no fixed essence? It's empty. It's empty of a Platonic metaphysical essence, emptiness. There is no essence. So what does that mean when we're looking at an object that's clearly there and clearly filled with material? Like a table. It's made of wood and it's made of metal. And when we look a little bit closer, we can see that holding those together are nails, screws, glue, whatever it is. And if we look beyond that, see the cause of that, we can understand that what went into that table is exactly what makes it, from the craftsmanship of the joinery to the fossil fuels burned in the production of the steel for that table. So seeing through emptiness, also translated as dependent origination, actually allows us to see phenomena as exactly the sum of their parts, that everything is a current snapshot composition of an entire embodied history, empty of a metaphysical essence. This idea isn't limited to Buddhism. We see it so many different vocabularies, so many different disciplines, and all the way from Aristotle, who said that form is the ever-evolving manifestation of some greater mysterious natural order, to something as intangible as anthropology and contemporary anthropology. Pierre Bourdieu said that every individual is subject to a metaphorical structure that structures them, and he calls that the habitus. And that states that everybody is under the weight of their active history.
So if we step outside of the existential realm and into the scientific realm, there are a lot of examples where scientists have used some interpretation of this principle to explain how both living and non-living matter behaves. For example, if we look at our metabolism, we look at each cell and what it needs to survive, that means constantly breaking down and building lipids and carbohydrates and amino acids. And this is constantly happening in order for a cell to respond to its environment, to grow, and to maintain its structure. So not only are these things constantly changing and they're constantly transforming, but they're actually composed of this very transformation, and they're defined by it. And if we go even deeper into that same cell, down to the atomic level, then Heisenberg described the behavior of electrons in a similar way. That not only are these things constantly moving and constantly changing, but it's important to acknowledge this if we are to understand how an atom works. We can think of these things, atoms, as tiny little systems in constant state of flux where every moment is different than the moment before, even though we have some idea of where the electrons are at any given moment. It's not precise. So we can think of cells as composed of atoms, and we're composed of cells, and all of these are dynamic systems in conversation with one another and dependent on constant change.
So maybe that doesn't matter for me so much when I'm thinking about walking across a floor, and maybe it doesn't inform my relationship to the floor to know that it's made up of tiny atoms in flux. But what about when I'm looking at a suffering human body? If I'm looking at a suffering human body and I'm understanding that body to be an entire composition of complex systems in dynamic conversation with one another, not seeing the body that way might not make very much sense. And if compassion is the concern for another state of being, and that's how you're understanding that being, denying that seems to us a little bit illogical.
And irresponsible if, as it is, medicine is founded on the idea that the body knows what it needs and can manifest that knowledge in intelligible ways. And this is what we call symptoms. So, for example, if I look at Molly and she is extremely fatigued and she's suffering from shortness of breath, good. And her skin is pale,
Debatable.
And all these things are happening in Molly's body, then we can take that as evidence that Molly's body is aware that there's some kind of imbalance happening. And it's communicating that outwardly. So maybe she has low hemoglobin. That is inner knowledge that manifests itself outwardly. And low hemoglobin is the diagnosis. These things that we notice on the outside are symptoms. But over the last century or so, we seem to have forgotten the conceptual basis for diagnosis, that the body really does know what it needs and it can tell it to us.
And maybe we've even gone a little bit too far with acknowledging that the body knows what it needs, so far as to think of the body as a machine. Maybe in part due to Descartes and his idea that we can understand the body mechanistically, that we can see our bodies as passive matter driven by mechanical forces. For example, if you have something like a herniated disc, 3/4 of us have one, have had one, or will have one. It seems like a perfect example of when we're experiencing some kind of mechanical failure in our body. It's one part that starts to fail us, and it's a perfect time to go in with a great, simple technological procedure to take out the faulty disc and put in a brand shiny new one. What are the two most common causes of a herniated disc? Posture and diet. What seems like a perfect mechanical failure is actually a situation where treating the empty body first might make a whole lot more sense.
And what if we look at something where it's not an isolated part that you can identify and say that that's the cause of the problem, like a herniated disc? What if it's a more complicated chronic illness where the symptoms are always changing and the source is unknown? And this is the case with the illnesses that are becoming more and more prevalent now that our life expectancies are growing. Heart disease, cancers, autoimmune diseases. And I'd like to look at rheumatology, which is the study of autoimmune diseases, and think about how we might benefit from applying emptiness there. It's common in these cases for patients to come in with a host of ambiguous symptoms and aches and pains and this whole set of issues that doesn't lend itself easily to any kind of diagnosis, let alone some kind of linear diagnosis, as is the case with something like a herniated disc. Often what happens is that patients come in and they present with this multitude of issues and no one quite knows what's going on, and they're prescribed steroids. Like prednisone, which is one of the most commonly prescribed steroids, and it has just all these crazy, terrible, debilitating side effects. Who even knows what vomiting coffee grounds is? It's unbelievable. And this is done just as a first step in order to see which symptoms might go away without even knowing what's going on in someone's body, which is extremely dangerous because when patients come into healthcare settings, they run the risk of feeling even worse. My mother has struggled with an autoimmune disorder for the last several years, and it wasn't until she was able to work with a clinician who was able to take a holistic, innovative approach and really hear her that she actually felt better. And the treatment itself wasn't the problem. We're not saying that science is the problem or that technology is the problem or that drugs are the problem. And we acknowledge that they're extremely useful tools, and Descartes' model was so important to us in advancing medical care as we know of it today. And my mom received a treatment that was the first time that something like that had been used in a case like hers. It wasn't that she went to a holistic medicine practitioner, but she was able to deal with a clinician that saw her as a whole body and could tell appropriately what to use and when. And her tangible well-being today is a testament to the possibilities of non-prescriptive, individualized care.
So what does that imply? That Natalie's mom was in conversation with her health provider, that Natalie's mom was active. Despite the fact that her mom's case was a unique one, and it was the first time that advanced technology was used for the purpose that it was used with her mom, that patient-doctor dynamic was still out of the ordinary for what's commonly upheld. We have the doctor-patient relationship that's often still active-passive, and we expect our healthcare providers to be objectively omniscient, and a lot of the time we present ourselves as a broken body with a little bit less agency than we actually have. And we wonder what it would mean if we started looking at ourselves emptily in a way that allowed us to see anatomical individuality, allowed us to see changes in our health, allowed us to see illness, debilitating illness, not necessarily as something to be immediately nixed, but as a potential space for growth and change. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus said that you can't step into the same river twice. We wonder what that would mean if every time we went to the doctor, we knew that we weren't the same patient twice.
We just ask that the next time you encounter a change in your health and you go to the doctor, you remember that you're an empty body in need of empty healing.
Thank you.